Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, I'm having a go at some AMD FSR testing. After all, I can't let Tim hog all the fun. And I get to do this because just one day after Tim completed his very impressive look at FSR, extremely popular multiplayer online arena game, Dota 2, received FidelityFX Super Resolution support. Today's video sponsor is Gigabyte and their exciting new range of AMD X570S motherboards. These new models do away with the chipset fan for quieter operation. They include huge VRM heatsinks and even better VRM components. And that means these new Gigabyte X570S motherboards will handle any and all AMD Ryzen processors with ease. The new X570S Aorus Master model is particularly impressive, featuring a better cooling design, board layout, and feature set. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. So while it was great to see the game support list growing so rapidly, I did immediately question just how useful such a technology would be for a game like Dota 2. And this is because it was my understanding that Dota 2 falls into a similar category to games such as StarCraft 2, in the sense that these old top-down strategy games aren't super demanding on the GPU and are instead almost always CPU limited. That being the case, technologies such as FSR that boost graphics performance have little chance of doing just that, as the game is limited by the CPU rather than the GPU. Moreover, when GPU limited, Dota 2 players simply turn down the quality settings and as a result end up once again becoming CPU limited. After all, Dota 2 isn't a game you play for the visuals, and really it could pass as something that you'd play on a phone. We are talking about an 8-year-old game here that wasn't terribly difficult to run back in 2013. And in fact, Dota 2 owes part of its success to the fact that you can really run it on anything, even a laptop with an Intel iGPU. So, is AMD attempting to boost performance in Dota 2 after all these years really as amazing as some gamers are making it out to be? Well, to find out, we've tested a range of low-end and rather old graphics cards, as well as some more modern iGPU solutions, and we've even taken a look at 4K gaming with some previous generation hardware as well. Now, working out exactly what approach to take for this testing has been a little bit difficult, as not everyone is looking to play Dota 2 in the same way. Some of you will simply lower the quality settings for maximum FPS, giving you that competitive edge that makes it easier to target units. On the other hand, some of you will want to crank up everything and enjoy the game with the best visuals possible, though I'd argue there's ultimately not that much difference between the two, as you're about to see. Point is though, not everyone is looking for the same experience, and not everyone is using the same hardware. So I want to work out where FSR is beneficial by coming at this from as many angles as possible. With all of that said, let's start by taking a look at Dota 2 without bringing FSR into the equation. So here's a side-by-side comparison between the highest and lowest quality settings. And this has been recorded at 1080p. Now, if your first impressions are anything like mine, you'll be of the belief that these two images are very similar. I know we're dealing with a bit of YouTube compression here, but even the high bitrate original source files are very similar. And that's surprising given that we're at opposite ends of the quality spectrum. Clearly, Dota 2 isn't a visually rich game. It wasn't in 2013, and it's certainly not now. But the point is, the difference between the lowest and highest quality settings isn't huge, certainly not like what we see in most other games. You might have noticed that shadows have been entirely removed with the lowest quality settings, but that's really the biggest change. Detailing of character models is only slightly reduced in most instances, while textures aren't radically different. The environment detailing is also quite similar, and really it's only the tree foliage that jumps out at you. Most of the visual effects are still present and really aren't dialed down that much. Of course, if you were to zoom in and start pixel peeping, the differences will become more obvious, but I think for games like Dota 2 that might be missing the point a little bit. Anyway, the lowest quality settings certainly make for a very playable experience, and if anything, I feel it's easier to spot enemy units, as the removal of stuff like shadows really helps with this. So if you're of the same opinion as me, that the game is fairly similar using either the lowest or highest quality visual settings, then this first set of results might shock you. Now please note, for all the testing, I've used the Ryzen 5 5600X with DDR4 3200 CL14 memory, so this is a strong CPU configuration. I've also included the Ryzen 3 2200G using its integrated Vega 8 graphics with the same memory, as well as the Core i5 11600K and its UHD graphics 750, again using the same DDR4 memory. Then for the benchmark itself, I'm using a pro game replay and I'm measuring performance at the later stages of the game, and each test was run for 30 seconds, which is plenty of time to accurately gather this data for a 3-run average. So keeping all of that in mind, along with the quality comparison just seen, here are some of the performance numbers. Starting from the top, we find the Core i5 11600K using its terrible UHD Graphics 750 integrated GPU. Using the highest quality settings, this iGPU is good for just 35 FPS on average at 1080p, so it is technically playable, but it's a pretty awful experience in my opinion. However, if we reduce the quality settings to their lowest values, the frame rate jumps up by an incredible 169%, so we're talking about roughly a 2.7 times improvement. That's nuts, and at 94 FPS the game is highly playable and really very enjoyable, and as we saw a moment ago, the visual quality isn't significantly diminished. Moving on, we see that when using the highest quality settings with the Ryzen 3 2200G with its Vega 8 graphics, it's much faster, spitting out 55 FPS. And then with the lowest quality settings, we're only looking at a 64% performance increase. And although that's still a huge improvement, it is much smaller than what we saw with the 11600K. And that's because the quad-core Ryzen 3 processor quickly becomes CPU bound. Now moving on to the discrete graphics solutions, we find the GeForce GTX 750 Ti, and these results don't look quite right when compared to what we saw with the iGPUs. Using the highest quality settings, things look pretty normal. The 750 Ti is 22% faster than the Vega 8 graphics of the Ryzen 3 2200G. However, as we move to the lowest quality settings, the frame rate blows up to a staggering 219 FPS on average, a whopping 227% increase from the high quality settings, and 143% faster than what the 2200G APU produced under the same conditions. The reason why the GTX 750 Ti is so fast here is down to the fact that it's being supported by the Ryzen 5 5600X, and in a way this has become a CPU test. A similar thing was also seen with the Radeon RX 550, HD 7770, and R7 260X. These Radeon GPUs were between 153 and 166% faster using the low quality settings. Even the dodgy bait and switch GeForce GT 1030 with DDR4 memory went from 34 FPS with the highest quality settings to 103 FPS using the lowest quality settings. So a 203% performance uplift there. Okay, so what those results tell us is pretty much anything can play Dota 2 at high frame rates using the lowest quality settings at 1080p. We're talking about 90 FPS at integrated graphics and over 100 FPS with basically any graphics card made in the last decade. In almost all instances, you'll be entirely CPU limited, and as a result, will probably feel the need to crank up the quality settings to balance out the load a bit better. Point is though, given what we now know about the difference in visual quality between the lowest and highest settings, as well as the performance difference, it makes me wonder just how useful FSR is going to be, especially for low-end hardware. So with that, let's first take a look at image quality. Here we're comparing native 100% render scale at 1080p using the highest quality settings to 75% FSR and 50% FSR configurations. This means 75% FSR is upscaling from an 810p image, while the 50% FSR is working from a 540p image. So very little data to go on there, and as a result the image is pretty terrible, with units so blurry it's often difficult to work out what's what. Even the 75% FSR is pretty bad at 1080p, and this is in line with Tim's own findings in more demanding games. Again, we're not zoomed in here, and yet it is quite obvious to me that FSR 75% is much softer than the native image, while 50% is unusable. Now here's a look at 75% FSR at 1080p using the highest quality settings versus 1080p with the lowest quality settings at 100% render scale. Again, it's the lack of shadows and foliage detail that is most noticeable in the left image, while some of the characters don't look quite as good, but although it's less detailed overall, I feel the sharper image does look better. Though of course that is entirely subjective, and my preference would be to play Dota 2 without shadows for that competitive advantage. Now here's a look at the lowest quality settings rendered natively and then with 75% and 50% FSR. Again, the 50% FSR image is very soft, though it actually doesn't look as bad as what it did using the highest quality settings, at least in my opinion, while 75% is now passable. Though it's interesting how some effects aren't rendered at all using FSR, such as the flame seen in those pots throughout the map. Finally, if we jump up to 1440p, the FSR quality does improve dramatically, and again, this is something Tim reported in his detailed look at FSR. Here we're comparing the image quality using the highest settings, and 75% FSR looks virtually indistinguishable from the native image. Meanwhile, 50% FSR is certainly softer, but I'd say it's passable here, especially for a game like Dota 2. Okay, so let's move into the blue bar graphs, and we'll start with the AMD and Intel iGPU solutions. Here we have the 1080p highest quality data, and we've already seen the 100% render scale or native performance, but what we haven't seen is the performance uplift FSR offers under these conditions. For the Core i5-11600K, we're only looking at a 14% increase improvement with FSR set to 75%, which isn't great given the noticeable downgrade in visual quality at 1080p. The frame rate is boosted by 43% over native using FSR 50%, but that setting was completely unusable in my opinion, so the data is somewhat meaningless. The Ryzen 3 2200G only saw an 18% improvement from 55 FPS to 65 FPS with FSR 75%, and then a further 8% increase with FSR at 50%, which is again unusable. The reason for the small performance upgrade here is likely due to the game becoming CPU bound. So given the rather significant drop in visual quality at 1080p when using FSR, I'd say these results are pretty disappointing. Of course, the 75% setting is usable, and we're looking at a 14 to 18% performance improvement, but I believe there is a much better way to achieve significantly better gains by just tweaking the quality settings. You can certainly go to more effort here to customize your own configuration, but simply using the lowest quality settings while maintaining a 100% render scale boosted the performance of the Core i5-11600K by almost 170%. Under these conditions, FSR becomes entirely useless, and in fact, the overhead can actually reduce performance depending on the level used. Now, the benefits of FSR at 1440p, for those of you who have already dialed down your quality settings in search of more FPS, still pretty limited. Again, we see that the Core i5-11600K went backwards in terms of FPS performance with FSR set to 75%, and could really only match the native performance with FSR at 50%, though the 1% low performance was improved. The 2200G gained 7% more frames when going from the native rendering to FSR at 75%, and then a further 8% with FSR set to 50%. So it's not nothing, but it's also hardly worth getting excited over. So the usefulness of FSR support in Dota 2 for integrated graphics users is pretty limited, and ultimately you're probably best off just leaving the render scale at 100% and instead tweaking the visual quality settings, because there's a good chance a part like the Ryzen 3 2200G, for example, will still be CPU bound with higher quality settings, so you can improve the look while maintaining that 90 FPS at 1080p. So what about old budget graphics cards like the Radeon R7 260X and GeForce GTX 750 Ti? Using the highest quality settings, FSR at 75% saw the GTX 750 Ti render 16% more frames, and the R7 260X just 14% more frames. Again, those are some pretty weak gains for what ends up being a very noticeable downgrade in visual quality, and although we do see bigger gains using FSR at 50%, the image quality is so bad at that point that it's really not worth discussing the results. And this is my real problem with FSR in Dota 2 for budget hardware. By lowering the quality settings, you get a much bigger performance gain for what's arguably a smaller downgrade in visual quality. Moreover, FSR has basically nothing to offer in the way of extra performance, as here you're limited by the Ryzen 5 5600X. And it's likely most gamers playing Dota 2 don't have a CPU as powerful as the Ryzen 5 5600X. Also, you don't need 200 plus FPS in Dota 2, a little over 100 FPS is plenty, so you've got loads of wriggle room here to manually tune the settings and improve image quality. Even at 1440p, FSR has nothing to offer gamers when using the lowest quality settings, and in some cases you'll end up losing performance, as seen with the GTX 750 Ti when using FSR at 75%. I've tested many more old or lower end GPUs, and the results are all much the same. Here's a look at the Radeon RX 550 and HD 7770 as another example. The older HD 7770 does enjoy a 22% performance boost with FSR at 75% when using the maximum in-game quality settings, while the RX 550 only saw an 11% improvement. But those gains are again called into question when using the lowest quality settings. Even at 1440p, both were able to render over 100 FPS at the native resolution. At this point, I'm pretty disappointed with what FSR delivers in Dota 2, but given what I knew about the game heading into this testing, I'm not terribly surprised. But anyway, before we wrap things up, here's a quick look at where FSR can be quite useful for those of you playing Dota 2, and as Tim found, it's 4K gaming where this technology really shines. For this test, I dug out the Radeon RX Vega 56 and GeForce GTX 1660. At the native 4K resolution, the GTX 1660 was good for 98 FPS on average, and Vega 56 blew by with 122 FPS. You could argue that this is more than enough for Dota 2, but if you're after a truly high refresh rate experience, FSR can help. Interestingly, in the case of Vega 56, we're only looking at an 18% performance boost using FSR at 75%, and this is similar to the gains we saw at 1080p using the highest quality settings with most budget or older GPUs. The GTX 1660, on the other hand, enjoyed a massive 40% performance uplift, jumping from 98 FPS to 137 FPS, and that's quite incredible given that there was no noticeable difference in image quality. In fact, even with FSR at 50%, the game wasn't as soft as what we saw at 1080p using the 75% render scale, and here the GTX 1660 rendered over 200 FPS, and that's quite incredible really. So for those of you trying to play Dota 2 at 4K but can't quite do it using the maximum in-game quality settings, FSR can be very useful. That said, you can quite easily achieve similar performance gains by just tweaking the quality settings, and in many instances this will have little impact on the overall visual quality. Again, Dota 2 just doesn't seem like the right kind of game to really take advantage of FSR. Just lastly, a few users have reported great image quality results when using FSR at 99%. Again, I don't feel that Dota 2 is a game that's really all about image quality, but if you want the sexiest Dota 2 you can have, then this might work. That said, be aware that by enabling a render scale of 99% with FSR enabled, you'll be sacrificing around 15 to 20% of your frame rate via the overhead that's associated with FSR. So there you have it. For most users, I feel FSR won't really be a game changer in Dota 2. For low-end users, the game is perfectly playable and really just as enjoyable using the lower quality settings, and here pretty much anything can deliver highly playable performance at 1080p, and in many instances 1440p isn't off the table either. Because FSR performs so poorly at 1080p, in my opinion you really are just better off lowering the quality settings, as this has less of an impact on visuals and a much more positive impact on the frame rate. FSR does make a little more sense at 1440p, and depending on your configuration it might be useful. And then for those of you trying to break into 4K gaming with Dota 2, FSR is likely going to be very useful, especially if you're not willing to compromise on visual quality at all. Although I don't feel that FSR is terribly useful in Dota 2 for most gamers, I also see no need to bash the implementation, as it's a free addition for those who want to use it, and if it only ends up being a niche feature that works well for a few gamers, then that's fine. AMD certainly promised you nothing here, you got it for free, so if it ends up being of benefit, then that's amazing, and if not, you've lost nothing. For those of you wondering if Nvidia's DLSS would have been more useful in a game like Dota 2, I'd say no it wouldn't, as you'd still suffer the same image quality issues at 1080p, and the overhead would likely make it even less suitable when trying to push high frame rates. Of course, that's assuming that you could actually use DLSS with low-end hardware, which you obviously can't, so in that sense DLSS has even less to offer than FSR. So like DLSS, FSR's usefulness is going to be limited. For games that'll run on a tech potato, it's going to be of little benefit, as we've seen here for Dota 2. And then for competitive gamers targeting high frame rates, the rendering overhead will also make them fairly useless. Where these types of rendering technologies will be useful will be for demanding games like Cyberpunk 2077, where you're not targeting hundreds of frames per second. Anyway, that's going to do it for my first look at FSR, and as Tim pointed out, it is a great technology when implemented in the right games, under the right conditions, but Dota 2 for the most part just isn't the right game to really showcase the technology. But it still ticks a box for marketing by adding a highly popular game to the support list, so there is that. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like, subscribe for more content, and if you'd like to support the channel directly and also get some pretty cool perks in return, then we do have our Discord server, monthly live streams to myself, Q&As, and behind the scenes content, so a lot of cool stuff there. So if you're interested, the links are in the video description, but if not, that's perfectly fine, and I would like to just thank you for watching this video. I'm your host Steve, and I'll see you again next time.